The raging floodwaters slammed against the wooden sides of the wagon, each impact sending terrifying tremors through Hannah Keller's body as she desperately clawed at the jammed door. Outside, the world had transformed from peaceful Montana countryside to a raging torrent in a matter of hours. And now, the 18-year-old found herself trapped in what threatened to become her floating coffin. It was the spring of 1882 in Deer Lodge, Montana Territory, and what had started as a routine journey back from visiting her aunt in the neighboring settlement had turned into a nightmare when the skies opened with a vengeance. The normally docile creek running alongside the trail had swollen rapidly, catching Hannah and her driver by surprise. The last she'd seen of old Mr. Winters was his panicked face as he was swept from the driver's seat when the wagon overturned, leaving Hannah alone as the rising waters carried the vehicle downstream. "Help!" she screamed, voice raw from shouting. "Somebody please help me!" The water was now ankle-deep inside the wagon, which had become lodged against something, a rock or a fallen tree. She couldn't tell. The vehicle groaned and shifted with each surge of the flood, threatening to break free at any moment and continue its deadly journey downstream. Hannah pounded her fists against the jammed door until her knuckles bled. Panic clawed at her chest as the water continued to rise inside the wagon. Her fine blue dress, a birthday gift from her father, was now sodden and heavy, clinging to her legs as she fought for her life. Through her terror, Hannah became aware of a sound cutting through the roar of the water hoofbeats and a man's voice. "Hello, anyone in there?" The voice was deep, commanding, carrying even over the rage of the flood. "Yes, I'm here. The door's stuck." Hannah cried out, relief and renewed fear warring within her. "Stand back," came the reply. Hannah pressed herself against the far side of the wagon, and seconds later, the door splintered under the force of what sounded like an axe. Water rushed in more rapidly now, but so did the face of her would-be rescuer, a man with intense blue eyes beneath the brim of a weather-beaten cowboy hat, his strong features set in determination. "Give me your hand," he shouted, reaching into the wagon. Hannah didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, grasping his outstretched arm. His grip was firm, sure, as he pulled her toward him. The wagon lurched suddenly, threatening to tear them apart. With a strength born of desperation, the stranger yanked Hannah through the broken door just as the wagon broke free of whatever had been holding it. She fell against his solid chest as they both tumbled backward onto the muddy embankment. Behind them, the wagon was instantly swept away by the churning waters, disappearing around a bend in what had once been a gentle creek. "I've got you," the man said, his arms still around her as they lay in the mud, both breathing heavily. "You're safe now." Hannah looked up into the face of the man who had saved her life, a face she would never forget. She didn't yet know his name was Lucas Stone, or that this moment would change the course of her life forever. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring waters. "I thought I was going to die in there." "Not while I'm around," Lucas replied, helping her to her feet. He stood a head taller than her, broad-shouldered and lean, his rain-soaked shirt clinging to a frame hardened by years of ranch work. "Lucas Stone," he offered, still holding her steady. "I've got a horse tied up on higher ground. We need to get you somewhere dry before you catch your death." Hannah nodded, still trembling from cold and fear. "Hannah Keller. I was on my way home to Deer Lodge." "Mr. Winters, the driver," her voice broke as the reality of what had happened hit her. Lucas's expression turned grim. "I saw a body downstream before I heard your cries. I'm sorry." Tears mingled with the rainwater on Hannah's face. Poor Mr. Winters had been driving her family's wagons for years. The thought that he was gone struck her with a fresh wave of grief. "Come on," Lucas said gently, guiding her up the slippery embankment with a steady hand at her elbow. "That water's still rising. We need to get to higher ground." Hannah allowed herself to be led to where a magnificent chestnut stallion stood waiting, its reins looped around a sturdy pine tree. Despite her exhaustion, she couldn't help but admire the beautiful animal. "This is Thunder," Lucas said, patting the horse's neck. "He's the fastest thing on 4 legs in this territory, and he's about to prove it." Without warning, he lifted Hannah onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. Then he swung up behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around to take the reins. "Where are we going?" Hannah asked, suddenly aware of how improper their situation was, a young, unmarried woman alone with a stranger, pressed against him on horseback. But propriety seemed a distant concern when set against survival. "My ranch is closer than town," Lucas answered, urging Thunder forward. "It's up on a ridge, safe from the flood. We'll get you warmed up, then figure out how to get word to your folks that you're alive." As they rode through the driving rain, Hannah found herself grateful for Lucas's solid presence behind her, for the strong arms that held the reins on either side of her, creating a cocoon of safety. She didn't know then that Lucas Stone was relatively new to Deer Lodge, having arrived just 6 months earlier to take over the struggling Double S ranch after his uncle's death. She didn't know that he was considered something of a mystery to the townsfolk, keeping mostly to himself and his small crew of ranch hands. And she certainly couldn't have known that this chance encounter during the worst flood in Deer Lodge's history would be the beginning of a love that would defy all expectations. The ride to the Double S ranch was a blur of rain and mud and the rhythmic movement of thunder beneath them. By the time they crested the final hill and the ranch house came into view, Hannah was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard she feared they might break. The ranch house was modest but solid, a 2-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch running its length. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, and even through the rain, Hannah could make out corrals and a large barn. As they approached, a wiry man with graying hair emerged from the barn, leading a horse inside out of the weather. He looked up at their approach, his expression changing from casual interest to concern when he spotted Hannah. "Frank," Lucas called over the storm, "get Mrs. Holden. We've got a half-drowned young lady here." The man nodded and disappeared into the house as Lucas guided Thunder under the shelter of a lean-to attached to the barn. He dismounted quickly, then reached up to help Hannah down. Her legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground, and Lucas caught her, lifting her into his arms without hesitation. "I can walk," she protested weakly, embarrassed by her own frailty. "Save your strength," Lucas replied, carrying her toward the house. "You've been through enough today." The warmth that greeted them as Lucas pushed through the front door was heavenly. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, a cheerful blaze crackling within. The furnishings were simple but of good quality, a large oak table with chairs, several comfortable-looking armchairs, and shelves filled with books lining one wall. A plump, middle-aged woman with kind eyes hurried toward them, already pulling a quilt from a chest near the fire. "Land's sake, Lucas, what have you found?" She spread the quilt over one of the chairs nearest the fire. "This is Miss Hannah Keller from Deer Lodge," Lucas explained as he gently set Hannah down on the chair. "Her wagon got caught in the flood. Mrs. Holden is my housekeeper," he added to Hannah. "The poor dear is soaked to the bone," Mrs. Holden clucked, already untying the sodden bonnet from Hannah's head. "We need to get her out of these wet clothes before pneumonia sets in. You men make yourselves scarce while I take care of her." Lucas nodded, stepping back. I'll send Frank to town as soon as it's safe to let your family know you're all right, Miss Keller. But the bridges might be out, and it won't be safe until the rain stops. Thank you, Hannah managed through chattering teeth. For everything. A flash of something Hannah couldn't quite identify crossed Lucas's face before he nodded again and retreated from the room, leaving her in Mrs. Holden's capable hands. The next hour passed in a blur of warm water, soft towels, and the blessed relief of dry clothes. Mrs. Holden had provided a simple but well-made dress that she explained had belonged to Lucas's late aunt, along with thick wool stockings and a warm shawl. Hannah's own clothes were hung by the kitchen fire to dry, though Mrs. Holden had clucked disapprovingly at the state of Hannah's fine dress, now mudded and torn. Now Hannah sat at the large oak table, a steaming mug of coffee between her hands, watching as Mrs. Holden bustled about preparing a meal. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but the worst of the storm seemed to have passed. "How long have you worked for Mr. Stone?" Hannah asked, trying to make conversation and learn more about her rescuer. Mrs. Holden smiled as she kneaded dough for what promised to be delicious fresh bread. "Going on 6 months now, ever since he inherited this place from his uncle. I worked for old Mr. Stone for nearly 15 years before he passed. God rest his soul. Lucas came all the way from Texas to take over, though I gather he was raised in these parts as a boy before his family moved south." "He's not married?" Hannah asked, then immediately blushed at her forwardness. Mrs. Holden's eyes twinkled knowingly. "No, miss, he is not. Keeps to himself mostly, focuses on building up the ranch. Old Mr. Stone let things slide in his later years, and Lucas has been working day and night to make this place profitable again." She lowered her voice. "He's a good man, though he doesn't let many people see it, treats his hands fair, works alongside them. Never raises his voice to me or anyone else that I've seen." The door opened then, and Lucas himself entered, having changed into dry clothes. His dark hair was still damp, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. He looked younger somehow, without his hat and duster, though Hannah guessed him to be in his late 20s. "Frank says the creek's still too high to cross safely," he announced. "We won't be able to get word to your family until tomorrow at the earliest, Miss Keller. I hope you'll be comfortable here until then." "I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Stone," Hannah replied formally, suddenly very aware of the impropriety of her situation. What would her father say when he learned she had spent the night in the home of an unmarried man, even with Mrs. Holden present as chaperone? It wasn't proper. Lucas seemed to read her thoughts. "Mrs. Holden has prepared the guest room for you upstairs. My room is at the opposite end of the hall, and Mrs. Holden sleeps in the room beside yours. Your reputation will be safe, I assure you." Hannah blushed again, embarrassed that he had so easily guessed her concerns. "I didn't mean to imply, no offense taken," Lucas cut in, his expression softening slightly. "I understand how important a young lady's reputation is." He turned to Mrs. Holden. "Something smells good." "Stew's nearly ready," the housekeeper replied, "and I'm baking fresh bread to go with it. Miss Keller here could use a good meal after her ordeal." "We all could," Lucas agreed, taking a seat at the table across from Hannah. "The hands are securing the livestock in case the water rises further. They'll eat in the bunkhouse tonight." As Mrs. Holden served the stew, Hannah found herself studying Lucas when he wasn't looking. There was a quiet intensity about him that both intimidated and fascinated her. His hands were strong and calloused from ranch work, but they handled his cutlery with surprising grace. A small scar ran along his jawline, and Hannah found herself wondering how he had acquired it. "Have you lived in Deer Lodge long, Miss Keller?" Lucas asked, breaking into her thoughts. Hannah nodded. All my life. My father owns the mercantile in town. Thomas Keller, Lucas looked surprised. I've done business with him. Good man, fair prices. He works hard, Hannah agreed, pleased by the compliment to her father. My mother passed 5 years ago, so I've been helping run the household since then. She didn't mention how stifling she sometimes found life in town, how she longed for something more than becoming some local businessman's wife, which seemed to be her father's plan for her. I'm sorry about your mother, Lucas said quietly. I lost both my parents in a fever outbreak when I was 16. It's not an easy thing. The simple acknowledgement of shared loss created a moment of connection between them, a brief lowering of the careful defenses Lucas seemed to maintain. The moment was broken by Frank's entrance, bringing news that one of the pregnant mares was showing signs of early labor, likely stressed by the storm. Lucas excused himself immediately, leaving Hannah with Mrs. Holden, who promptly began sharing stories of life on the ranch that had Hannah laughing despite her exhaustion. By the time Mrs. Holden showed Hannah to her room for the night, the young woman found herself unexpectedly intrigued by Lucas Stone. He was unlike any of the young men in Deer Lodge who had come calling more serious, certainly, but there was a depth to him that drew her curiosity. As she slipped beneath the quilts on the comfortable bed, Hannah told herself that her interest was merely gratitude to the man who had saved her life. Nothing more. But in the quiet darkness, with rain pattering against the window, Hannah couldn't deny the flutter in her chest when she remembered the feel of his strong arms around her as they rode to safety, or the intense blue of his eyes when he'd looked at her across the dinner table. It was foolishness, of course. Once the floodwaters receded, she would return to her life in town, and Lucas Stone would remain on his isolated ranch, their paths unlikely to cross again. Little did Hannah know, as she drifted off to sleep, that downstairs Lucas sat before the fire, turning a delicate handkerchief over in his hands, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials HK that had fallen from Hannah's pocket. As he traced the fine stitching with his thumb, he found himself unable to forget the feel of her in his arms, or the courage she had shown in the face of near-certain death. Lucas Stone, who had promised himself he would never again open his heart to loss after burying his parents and later his uncle, found himself thinking of ways to see Hannah Keller again once she returned to town. The storm that had thrown them together continued to rage outside, but inside the ranch house, something equally powerful and far more enduring had begun to take root. Morning brought weak sunshine filtering through scattered clouds, and the welcome sound of birdsong replacing the previous day's howling winds. Hannah woke disoriented at first, the unfamiliar room confusing her, until memories of the flood and her rescue came rushing back. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dry but still bearing evidence of her ordeal in the form of mud stains and a small tear along the hem. When she descended the stairs, she found Mrs. Holden already at work in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the air. "Good morning, dear," the housekeeper greeted her warmly. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Hannah admitted, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Holden offered. "Is Mr. Stone about?" "He's been up since before dawn, checking on the livestock and assessing the damage from the flood. Frank rode out at first light to see if the road to town is passable yet." Mrs. Holden set a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread before Hannah. "Eat up now. You need your strength." Hannah had just finished her breakfast when the front door opened and Lucas entered, his boots muddy and his expression grim. "The news isn't good," he announced without preamble. "The bridge to town is gone, washed clean away. The creek's gone down some, but it's still too dangerous to ford with a horse, let alone a wagon." Hannah's heart sank. How long until I can get home? Lucas removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. Hard to say. 3 days, maybe more, depending on how fast the water recedes and how quickly they can get a temporary bridge up. Your father will be worried sick. Can't we send a message somehow? Hannah asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. Her father would indeed be frantic, perhaps even organizing search parties that would put others at risk. Lucas considered for a moment. The telegraph line to Helena is likely down, but Frank might be able to make it to the Collins place about 5 miles east. Their property sits higher, and they might have a way to get a message to town from the other direction. I'd be so grateful, Hannah said sincerely. Lucas nodded. I'll send him after he's had some rest. In the meantime, I'm afraid you're stuck with us, Miss Keller. Hannah, she corrected him impulsively. After saving my life, I think you've earned the right to use my given name, Mr. Stone. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Lucas, then. For a moment they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them before Mrs. Holden bustled in with more coffee, breaking the spell. The day passed more pleasantly than Hannah would have expected. Unable to sit idle despite Mrs. Holden's insistence that she rest after her ordeal, Hannah helped with household tasks, finding comfort in the familiar routines of domestic work. By mid-afternoon, Frank had returned with news that the Collins family would send a rider toward Deer Lodge from the north, carrying word that Hannah was safe at the Double S Ranch. Your father will still worry, Lucas commented as they sat on the front porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. But at least he'll know you're alive. Yes, Hannah agreed, drawing her borrowed shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the evening chill. Though I'm not sure how he'll feel about my current accommodations. Lucas gave her a sidelong glance. Your reputation matters to you. It wasn't a question, but Hannah answered anyway. Of course. I don't want to be the subject of town gossip, she sighed. Though I suppose this adventure will give them plenty to talk about regardless. People talk, Lucas said with a shrug. It's what they do when their own lives aren't interesting enough. I learned long ago not to concern myself with it. That's easier for a man, Hannah pointed out. Women are judged more harshly for every perceived impropriety. True enough, Lucas conceded. After a moment of silence, he added, for what it's worth, I'll make it clear to anyone who asks that Mrs. Holden was present at all times and that you were treated with nothing but respect in this house. The sincerity in his voice touched Hannah. Thank you. They fell into companionable silence, watching as the setting sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The flood-swollen creek was visible from the porch, still running high but no longer the raging torrent of the previous day. It's beautiful here, Hannah said softly. It is, Lucas agreed. That's why my uncle chose this spot for the ranch house. Said a man should begin and end his day with something beautiful to look at. Your uncle sounds like he was a wise man, in some ways. Lucas's tone held a complexity that intrigued Hannah. He built this ranch from nothing, made it one of the finest in the territory at one time. But he was a hard man to know, kept people at a distance. By the end, he was alone except for his hired hands and Mrs. Holden. Is that why you came back? Because he was alone? Lucas turned to look at her, seeming surprised by her perception. Partly. He wrote to me a few months before he died, asked me to come. I was too late to see him alive, but I arrived in time for the funeral. He paused. How did you know I'd been here before? Mrs. Holden mentioned you grew up in these parts before moving to Texas, Hannah explained. A faint smile crossed Lucas's face. She likes to talk, our Mrs. Holden. She cares about you, Hannah observed. She worries you work too hard. There's a lot to do if I'm going to make this place what it once was. Lucas gestured toward the pastures and outbuildings. My uncle let things slide in his later years. Equipment rusting, fences falling down, breeding stock sold off to pay debts. Why is it so important to you? Hannah asked. You could have stayed in Texas, sold this place. Lucas was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "This land was my father's before it was my uncle's. He lost it in a bad business deal when I was just a boy. That's why we moved south." His jaw tightened. "I swore if I ever had the chance I'd get it back, make it something my father would have been proud of." The personal revelation, clearly not something Lucas shared easily, created a new sense of intimacy between them. Hannah found herself wanting to know more about this complex man who had saved her life. "Tell me about Texas," she prompted, genuinely curious. To her surprise, Lucas began to talk, his deep voice painting pictures of vast open plains, cattle drives under starlit skies, and the hard men who made their living from the unforgiving land. As twilight deepened into night, he spoke of his years learning the ranching business, working his way up from cowhand to foreman on one of the largest spreads in the Texas Panhandle. Hannah, in turn, shared stories of growing up in Deer Lodge, of helping in her father's store, of her dreams of someday seeing more of the world than just Montana territory. She found Lucas to be a good listener, asking thoughtful questions and seeming genuinely interested in her answers. "It's getting late," Lucas finally said, standing and offering Hannah his hand to help her up from her chair. "Mrs. Holden will be wondering where we've disappeared to." As Hannah placed her hand in his, she felt that same inexplicable flutter in her chest. His hand was warm and strong around hers, and for a moment after she stood, neither of them moved to break the contact. "Thank you for the conversation," Hannah said softly. "It made me forget my worries for a while." "The pleasure was mine," Lucas replied, his voice equally quiet in the darkness. Reluctantly, he released her hand. "Good night, Hannah." "Good night, Lucas." As she climbed the stairs to her borrowed room minutes later, Hannah found herself replaying their conversation in her mind, analyzing every word, every look they had shared. It was foolish, she knew. In a few days, she would return to town and to her life there. Lucas Stone was not the sort of man her father would approve of for courting his daughter too rough around the edges, too solitary, too focused on his ranch rather than building a place in society. Yet as she drifted off to sleep, it was Lucas's face she saw in her mind, not the eager young bank clerk her father had been encouraging to call on her, nor the well-established lawyer who had made his interest known at the last town social. Just Lucas, with his quiet intensity and surprising gentleness, and the way his rare smile transformed his serious face into something that made her heart race. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Hannah helped Mrs. Holden prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, who trooped in from the bunkhouse with mud-caked boots and hearty appetites. They were a rough but polite group, clearly curious about their boss's unexpected guest, but too well-mannered to ask direct questions. Lucas was noticeably absent, having ridden out at first light to check on cattle that had scattered during the storm. When he finally returned mid-morning, his expression was troubled. "We lost at least a dozen head that I can find so far," he reported to Frank as Hannah helped Mrs. Holden clear the breakfast dishes. "Swept downstream in the flood, and the south pasture fencing is down in 3 places." "Could be worse, boss," Frank replied philosophically. "Simmons over at the Circle S lost his entire herd of yearlings, according to Ben Collins." Lucas nodded grimly. "We'll start repairs on the fences today. Can't risk losing any more stock." Hannah, feeling awkward and useless as the men discussed the work to be done, spoke up impulsively. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Lucas turned to her, seeming to notice her presence for the first time since entering. For a moment, he looked as if he might refuse her offer, but then his expression softened slightly. "Can you ride?" The question surprised her. "Yes, though I'm more accustomed to side-saddle in town." A hint of amusement touched Lucas's eyes. "I'm afraid we don't have any side-saddles here, but if you're willing to ride astride, I could use an extra pair of eyes. Some of our calves might still be stranded on high ground along the creek." Mrs. Holden made a sound of disapproval. "Lucas Stone, you can't be thinking of taking this young lady out on a roundup. She nearly drowned yesterday." "It's all right, Mrs. Holden," Hannah said quickly, excited by the prospect of doing something useful, and if she was honest with herself, spending more time with Lucas. "I'm stronger than I look, and I'd like to help after all the kindness you've shown me." The housekeeper still looked doubtful, but Lucas nodded. "Get changed into something practical. Frank's wife left some riding clothes here last time they visited. They might fit you well enough. Mrs. Holden can show you." An hour later, Hannah found herself perched atop a gentle mare named Daisy, dressed in borrowed trousers and a flannel shirt that Mrs. Holden had cinched at the waist with a leather belt. The outfit was scandalously improper by town standards, but eminently practical for riding the rugged terrain along the creek. "You look like a natural," Lucas commented as Hannah guided Daisy alongside his own mount, Thunder. Hannah couldn't help but laugh. "I look like a boy." "Hardly," Lucas replied, his gaze lingering on her face in a way that brought heat to her cheeks. "But you do look more comfortable than I expected." "My father would have a fit if he could see me now," she admitted. "He believes ladies should be ladies at all times." "Out here, practicality trumps social rules," Lucas said. A fact my aunt never quite accepted, much to my uncle's frustration. They rode at a leisurely pace, following the creek downstream. Lucas pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the land, occasionally stopping to inspect areas where the flooding had caused damage. They found 3 stranded calves in the first 2 hours, guiding the frightened animals back to their mothers in the main herd. Around midday, they stopped on a grassy knoll overlooking a bend in the creek. Lucas produced a simple lunch that Mrs. Holden had packed: bread, cheese, and apples, which they shared as they let the horses graze nearby. "Thank you for bringing me along," Hannah said, leaning back on her elbows to enjoy the sunshine on her face. "This is far more enjoyable than sitting at the ranch house feeling useless." "You've got a good eye," Lucas acknowledged. "You spotted that last calf before I did." "I've always been observant," Hannah said. "It comes from helping in the store. You learn to notice details which customers need assistance, which ones are likely to shoplift if not watched carefully. Your father's lucky to have you." Hannah sighed. "Sometimes I think he'd be happier if I were more like other young ladies in town, more concerned with socials and suitors than with bookkeeping and inventory." "Is that what you want? Socials and suitors?" There was something in Lucas's tone that made Hannah look at him sharply. "No," she admitted after a moment. "I mean, I enjoy a good dance as much as anyone, but—" She hesitated, not sure how to express her discontent with the limited options available to her as a woman in Deer Lodge. "But it's not enough," Lucas finished for her, understanding in his eyes. "Exactly." Hannah was surprised by how easily he had grasped what she was trying to say. "I want more from life than just being someone's wife, keeping a tidy home and raising children. Those things are important, of course, but I want—" She trailed off, embarrassed by her own boldness. "Adventure," Lucas suggested. "Purpose." "Yes," Hannah agreed, relieved that he didn't seem to find her ambitions ridiculous. "My father wants me to marry Harold Whitcomb, the bank clerk. He's a perfectly nice man, but the thought of spending my life as Mrs. Whitcomb, hosting tea parties and discussing the latest fashions from back east." She shuddered slightly. So what would you rather do? If you could choose anything? Hannah considered the question seriously. I'd like to travel, see something of the world beyond Montana. Perhaps help run a business, something more exciting than a small-town mercantile. I've always loved books, maybe a bookshop of my own someday. She laughed self-consciously. It sounds silly when I say it aloud. It doesn't sound silly at all, Lucas said quietly. Dreams are what keep us going through the hard times. Without them, what's the point of any of it? The simple validation of her dreams touched Hannah deeply. None of her suitors in town had ever asked what she wanted from life. They had all simply assumed she wanted what every young woman was supposed to want: marriage, a home, children. What about you? She asked. Is this ranch your only dream, or do you have others? Lucas was silent for a moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. The ranch is enough for now, he finally said. Getting it back to what it was, making it successful again, that's what drives me. And after that? Hannah pressed gently. A faint smile touched Lucas's lips. Persistent, aren't you? Observant, remember. Hannah returned his smile. You're restoring the ranch for your father's memory, but what do you want for yourself? Lucas looked at her with new respect, as if surprised by her insight. I haven't thought that far ahead, he admitted. For years, getting this land back was all I focused on. Now that I have it. He shrugged. I suppose I'd like to build something that lasts, something I could pass on to children of my own someday. The mention of children created a moment of awkward awareness between them. Hannah looked away first, suddenly very conscious of their isolation and the growing attraction she could no longer deny she felt toward this man. We should head back, Lucas said, standing and offering his hand to help her up. There's still the north pasture to check before dark. The rest of the afternoon passed in a companionable rhythm as they continued their search for stranded livestock. They found 2 more calves and a wayward bull that had taken refuge on a small island in the middle of the still swollen creek. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the sun was setting, and Hannah was exhausted but exhilarated by the day's activities. Over dinner, Hannah shared their adventures with Mrs. Holden, who clucked disapprovingly at the mud staining Hannah's borrowed clothes but couldn't hide her pleasure at seeing the young woman so animated. Lucas was quieter, but Hannah caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster whenever their eyes met. After the meal, as Hannah helped Mrs. Holden with the dishes, the older woman said casually, "It's been a long time since I've seen the boss smile so much." Hannah focused intently on the plate she was drying. "He seems very serious about his work." "Oh, he is," Mrs. Holden agreed. "But today he seemed lighter somehow. Your company does him good, Miss Keller." "Hannah," she corrected automatically, not knowing how else to respond to the housekeeper's observation. Mrs. Holden smiled knowingly. "Hannah, then. All I'm saying is that some men need the right kind of company to bring out their best selves. Lucas has been alone too long, carrying the weight of his family legacy without anyone to share the burden." Before Hannah could formulate a reply to this pointed comment, Lucas himself entered the kitchen. "Frank just got back from town," he announced. "The creek's gone down enough that they've rigged a temporary crossing. We can take you home tomorrow, Hannah." The news, which should have filled her with relief, instead caused a pang of something like disappointment. "Oh, that's good news. Your father will be glad to have you back safe," Lucas said, his tone neutral. "Frank says he's been beside himself with worry, even after getting word you were here." "Yes, of course," Hannah agreed, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "I'm very grateful for your hospitality, but I shouldn't impose any longer than necessary." An awkward silence fell, broken only by Mrs. Holden's deliberate clattering of dishes as she excused herself to check on something in the pantry, leaving Hannah and Lucas alone. "I'll have your dress ready for you to wear back to town," Lucas said after a moment. "Mrs. Holden did her best with the stains." "Thank you." Hannah folded the dish towel she'd been using, needing something to do with her hands. "For everything. I don't know how to repay your kindness." "There's no debt between us," Lucas replied, his voice low. "Knowing you're safe is payment enough." Hannah looked up at him then, finding his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Still, I wish there was some way to thank you properly." For a moment, it seemed Lucas might step closer, might say or do something to acknowledge the tension that had been building between them since that first night. Instead, he took a deep breath and stepped back. "You should rest," he said, his tone once again formal. "We'll leave after breakfast tomorrow." With that, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving Hannah to wonder if she had imagined the connection between them, or if Lucas Stone was simply better than most at controlling his emotions. That night, as Hannah prepared for bed, she found herself filled with a strange melancholy at the thought of returning to town the next day. Her time at the Double S Ranch had awakened something in her, a taste for freedom, for unconventional experiences, and most disturbing of all, feelings for a man unlike any she had known before. As she drifted off to sleep, Hannah told herself sternly that these feelings were nothing more than a natural result of the dramatic circumstances of their meeting. Lucas Stone had saved her life. Of course, she felt a connection to him. Once she was back in town, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of her normal life, these unsettling emotions would fade, and she would look back on this interlude as nothing more than an exciting adventure to share with her grandchildren someday. But even as she formed the thought, Hannah knew in her heart that she was lying to herself. Something had changed in her during these few days, something fundamental that could not be undone simply by returning to Deer Lodge. Morning arrived with a bittersweet quality for Hannah. She dressed in her own clothes, now clean but still bearing signs of her ordeal. Mrs. Holden had prepared a special breakfast, complete with fresh baked cinnamon rolls that filled the house with their tempting aroma. "To fortify you for the journey," the housekeeper explained, pressing a package of extra rolls into Hannah's hands. "For your father, too. A man who's been worried sick deserves a treat." Hannah hugged the older woman impulsively. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Holden. I'll miss your cooking." "And I'll miss having a young woman around the place," Mrs. Holden replied, returning the hug. "It's been too long since these walls heard a lady's laughter." Outside, Lucas was loading Hannah's few possessions into a wagon. Thunder was hitched to the front, along with another horse Hannah hadn't seen before. "Where did the wagon come from?" she asked, approaching. "Borrowed it from the Collins place," Lucas explained. "Figured you'd be more comfortable than riding double all the way to town." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Hannah. "Thank you." Lucas helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a brief moment, they were close enough that Hannah could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her face. Then he stepped back and circled around to climb up beside her. With a final wave to Mrs. Holden and the ranch hands who had gathered to see them off, Lucas clicked to the horses, and they set off down the long drive toward the main road. The journey to town was surprisingly pleasant, despite Hannah's mixed feelings about returning home. The day was clear and mild, the countryside washed clean by the recent rains. Lucas pointed out various landmarks along the way, sharing stories about the area that revealed how deeply he had researched his family's history with the land. As they approached the temporary bridge that had been constructed across the still swollen creek, Hannah's heart began to beat faster. Once they crossed, they would be less than an hour from Deer Lodge. Her brief adventure was coming to an end. "Lucas," she said suddenly, turning to him. "Will I see you in town sometimes?" He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I don't come in often. Too much work at the ranch." "Of course," Hannah replied, trying to hide her disappointment. "I understand." Lucas glanced at her then, his expression softening. "But I do need supplies now and then. Perhaps I'll see you at your father's store." It wasn't much, but it was something. Hannah smiled. "I'd like that." They crossed the makeshift bridge carefully, the structure creaking ominously but holding firm under the wagon's weight. On the other side, the road to town was muddy but passable. They passed several other wagons heading in the opposite direction, the drivers calling out greetings and eyeing Hannah with curious expressions that suggested news of her adventure had already spread throughout the community. As they crested the final hill and Deer Lodge came into view, Hannah felt a surge of conflicting emotions. There was the natural relief at seeing her hometown safe after the flood, but also a surprising reluctance to return to the constraints of her life there. Lucas guided the wagon down the main street, drawing curious stares from townsfolk who recognized Hannah sitting beside the reclusive rancher. By the time they pulled up in front of Keller's Mercantile, a small crowd had gathered, including Hannah's father, who rushed out of the store at the sight of them. "Hannah," Thomas Keller called, his weathered face alight with relief. He reached the wagon before Lucas could help Hannah down, practically lifting her from the seat in his eagerness to assure himself she was truly safe. My girl," he murmured, embracing her tightly. "I thought I'd lost you too." Hannah returned her father's embrace, suddenly overwhelmed with guilt for having caused him such worry. "I'm fine, Pa, truly. Thanks to Mr. Stone." Thomas Keller released his daughter and turned to Lucas, who had descended from the wagon and stood waiting quietly. "Mr. Stone," Keller said, extending his hand, "I can't thank you enough for saving my daughter's life." Lucas shook the offered hand. "Anyone would have done the same, sir." "Not anyone would have heard her cries over that storm, or risked their own neck to break into a floating wagon," Keller countered. "You're a brave man, Mr. Stone, and I'm eternally in your debt." Lucas looked uncomfortable with the praise. Miss Keller showed considerable courage herself. "You should be proud of her." "Oh, I am," Keller assured him, putting an arm around Hannah's shoulders. "She's all I have left in this world and precious beyond measure." Hannah felt a blush rising to her cheeks at being discussed this way, particularly in front of the growing crowd of onlookers. Among them, she noticed Harold Whitcomb hovering nearby, his expression a mixture of relief and something that looked oddly like suspicion as he glanced between Hannah and Lucas. "Mr. Stone was kind enough to provide me shelter at his ranch until the roads were passable," Hannah explained, addressing the crowd as much as her father. Mrs. Holden, his housekeeper, was present at all times, of course. She felt ridiculous having to make such a clarification, but she knew how quickly rumors could spread in a small town like Deer Lodge. Her father nodded approvingly. Of course. And now you're home safe, thank the Lord." He turned back to Lucas. "You must come for dinner soon, Mr. Stone. Allow me to thank you properly for what you've done." Lucas hesitated, his eyes meeting Hannah's briefly before he replied, "That's very kind of you, Mr. Keller. Perhaps when things settle down at the ranch." "Whenever you can manage it," Keller insisted. "Our door is always open to you." With that, he began guiding Hannah toward the store, where several of the town's matrons waited eagerly to hear the details of her ordeal. Hannah glanced back over her shoulder at Lucas, who still stood beside the wagon. "Thank you again," she called to him. Lucas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. "Take care, Miss Keller." The formality stung after the easy companionship they had shared over the past days, but Hannah understood its necessity in front of the watching townsfolk. Still, she couldn't help feeling as though something precious was slipping away as Lucas climbed back onto the wagon and began the journey back to his ranch. The next few hours passed in a blur of explanations and expressions of concern from neighbors and customers. Hannah repeated the story of her rescue dozens of times, carefully emphasizing Mrs. Holden's constant presence at the ranch and downplaying the time she had spent alone with Lucas. By evening, she was exhausted from the attention and grateful when her father finally closed the store and they could retreat to the privacy of their home above the mercantile. Over a simple supper prepared by Hannah, Thomas Keller studied his daughter with thoughtful eyes. "You seem different," he observed. "More, I don't know, alive somehow." Hannah looked up from her plate, surprised by his perception. "Do I, Keller nodded slowly. "Something about the way you hold yourself, the way you speak, almost as if—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "As if what, Pa?" "As if you grew up all at once while you were gone." He smiled sadly. "Your mother would say you finally found your spirit." Hannah felt tears pricking at her eyes at the mention of her mother, who had always understood Hannah's restless nature better than her father did. "I was only gone a few days." "Sometimes a few days is all it takes to change a person," her father replied sagely. "Especially days like the ones you've had." They ate in silence for a while before Keller spoke again. "Harold came by every day while you were missing. He was quite concerned." Hannah suppressed a sigh. Her father's hints about Harold Whitcomb's interest had become increasingly less subtle in recent months. "That was kind of him. He's a steady young man, good prospects with the bank." Keller studied her reaction. "He mentioned calling on you this Sunday if you're feeling up to receiving visitors." "I'm not an invalid, Pa," Hannah replied, more sharply than she'd intended. Softening her tone, she added, "But I'm not sure I'm ready for callers just yet. It's been a lot to take in." Her father nodded, accepting this without argument, which surprised Hannah. Usually, he was more persistent in his encouragement of Harold's suit. "Whatever you need, my girl," he said gently. "You've been through an ordeal. Take all the time you need to recover." That night, in the comfort of her own bedroom, Hannah found herself unable to sleep. She stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street below, her thoughts turning inevitably to the Double S Ranch and its enigmatic owner. What was Lucas doing now? Was he thinking of her at all, or had he already returned to his solitary existence, focused solely on rebuilding his family legacy? Hannah pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. It was foolish to dwell on these thoughts. Lucas Stone had saved her life and shown her kindness, nothing more. The connection she had felt between them was likely one-sided, a product of her gratitude and the intensity of their shared experience. Yet, as she finally climbed into bed, Hannah couldn't help remembering the way Lucas had looked at her sometimes when he thought she wouldn't notice, with a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the growing attraction between them. Had that been real, or merely her imagination? Sleep eventually claimed her, but her dreams were filled with raging floodwaters and a pair of intense blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of Lucas Stone in town. Hannah resumed her duties at the mercantile, keeping the books and serving customers with her usual efficiency. But those who knew her well noticed a new distraction in her manner, a tendency to glance up hopefully whenever the bell above the door announced a new customer. Harold Whitcomb called as promised that first Sunday after her return, bringing flowers and expressing his profound relief at her safe return. Hannah received him politely but without enthusiasm, finding his careful conversation about the bank's business and the latest town gossip unbearably dull after the raw honesty of her discussions with Lucas. "You seem distant today, Miss Keller," Harold observed as he prepared to leave. "I hope your ordeal hasn't affected your health." "I'm quite well, thank you," Hannah assured him. "Perhaps still a little tired." Harold nodded, accepting this explanation. "Then I'll call again next Sunday if I may, when you're more yourself." That was the problem, Hannah thought as she watched him walk away. She wasn't sure she would ever be herself again, at least, not the self Harold Whitcomb and her father expected her to be. The woman who had emerged from that flood was different from the one who had entered it, changed in ways she was still discovering. It was nearly a month after the flood when Lucas Stone finally appeared in Keller's mercantile. Hannah was alone in the store, her father having gone to the bank to discuss business matters, when the bell above the door jangled and Lucas stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. "Mr. Stone," Hannah said, her heart racing as she set aside the inventory list she'd been working on. "Welcome, Miss Keller," Lucas nodded, looking somewhat uncomfortable as he approached the counter. "I hope I find you well, very well, thank you." Hannah smoothed her apron nervously. "And you, how is the ranch coming along?" Lucas replied. "We've repaired most of the flood damage. Lost some stock, but not as many as we feared." He glanced around the store. "Is your father available? I need to place an order for supplies." "He's at the bank, but I can help you," Hannah offered, trying to hide her disappointment that his visit was purely for business. "What do you need?" Lucas produced a list, which Hannah took, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The simple contact sent a jolt of awareness through her that she struggled to conceal as she began noting down his requirements. "These nails will have to be ordered from Helena," she informed him, keeping her eyes on the list. "They should arrive within a week. Everything else we have in stock." Lucas nodded. "That's fine. No rush on the nails." As Hannah continued writing down his order, a silence grew between them, filled with unspoken questions and things left unsaid. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Hannah looked up. "Why haven't you come for dinner?" she asked directly. "My father meant his invitation sincerely." Lucas seemed taken aback by her directness. "I've been busy at the ranch," he said after a moment, "and I wasn't sure if—" He trailed off. "If what?" "If my presence would be welcome given the circumstances of our acquaintance," Lucas finished. Small towns have long memories and active imaginations. Hannah set down her pencil. "You think people are gossiping about us, aren't they?" She couldn't deny it. There had been whispers, speculative glances, and thinly veiled questions about her time at the Double S Ranch. "Some," she admitted, "but nothing scandalous. Mrs. Holden's presence saw to that. Still," Lucas said, "a young woman like you has her reputation to consider. Your future." "My future is my concern," Hannah replied with more spirit than she'd intended. Lowering her voice, she added, "Besides, you saved my life. Surely that earns you the right to share a meal at our table without causing a scandal." The corner of Lucas's mouth lifted slightly. "When you put it that way." "Sunday," Hannah said decisively. "After church." "My father will be delighted, and she hesitated. "I would like the chance to thank you properly for what you did." Lucas studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "Sunday, then. Thank you for the invitation." They finished the business of his order in a more comfortable silence, and when Lucas left a few minutes later, Hannah felt a lightness in her chest that had been absent since her return to town. Sunday couldn't come quickly enough for Hannah. She took special care with her appearance that morning, choosing her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranging her dark hair in a style more elaborate than her usual simple bun. Her father raised his eyebrows at her efforts, but made no comment as they walked to church together. Throughout the service, Hannah found herself unable to focus on Reverend Miller's sermon, her thoughts continually drifting to the upcoming dinner. Would Lucas actually come? What would her father think of him in a social setting rather than the emotional context of Hannah's rescue? And most troubling of all, why did it matter so much to her? These questions continued to occupy her mind as she and her father returned home, and she began preparing the meal, a roast with vegetables and fresh bread, followed by an apple pie cooling on the windowsill. It was a simple dinner by some standards, but Hannah had put her heart into every dish. When a knock came at the door precisely at the appointed time, Hannah's heart leaped into her throat. Her father answered while she remained in the kitchen, suddenly nervous about facing Lucas again. "Mr. Stone, right on time," she heard her father say warmly. "Please come in." Hannah took a deep breath, smoothed her apron one last time, and stepped into the small parlor. Lucas stood just inside the door, looking uncomfortable but handsome in clean clothes that, while not fancy, were clearly his best. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously as he greeted her father. "Miss Keller," he said when he saw her, his eyes warming in a way that made Hannah's pulse quicken. "Thank you for the invitation." "We're delighted you could join us, Mr. Stone," she replied formally, aware of her father's curious gaze moving between them. "Dinner is almost ready. Please make yourself comfortable." The initial awkwardness gradually eased as they sat down to eat. Thomas Keller, always a genial host, kept the conversation flowing with questions about the ranch and observations about the town's recovery from the flood. Lucas, though not naturally talkative, responded thoughtfully, revealing a depth of knowledge about ranching that clearly impressed Hannah's father. "You've done remarkable work with that place in just 6 months," Keller commented as Hannah served the pie. "Old Jeremiah let it go to seed in his later years. Most folks thought it would never recover." "It's still a long way from what it was in its prime," Lucas replied, "but we're making progress. Planning to stay in Deer Lodge for the long term then?" Keller asked casually, though Hannah detected an underlying purpose to the question. Lucas glanced at Hannah before answering. "That's my intention. The double S is Stone land. Always has been, even when it wasn't in our possession. Now that I have it back, I don't plan to let it go again." "A man should have roots," Keller approved. "Something to build on, to pass down to his children someday." Hannah felt her cheeks warm at this blatant reference to future generations, but Lucas took it in stride. "That's the hope," he agreed. "Though I've got a lot of building to do before I need to worry about heirs." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Hannah noticed a new thoughtfulness in her father's manner as he observed Lucas. By the time the meal ended and Lucas took his leave, promising to return the following Sunday if the invitation still stood, Thomas Keller was looking at the young rancher with undisguised approval. "A solid young man," he commented, as he and Hannah washed dishes together after Lucas had gone. "Works hard, thinks ahead. Not much for fancy talk, but says what he means and means what he says." "Yes," Hannah agreed cautiously, unsure where her father was heading with these observations. "Different from Harold," Keller continued, handing her a plate to dry. "Harold's always got the right words, but sometimes I wonder if there's much substance behind them." Hannah nearly dropped the plate in surprise. Her father had never before expressed anything but wholehearted approval of Harold Whitcomb. "You like Mr. Stone," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I do," her father admitted. "Didn't expect to, if I'm being honest. When you first came back from his ranch, I had my doubts. Heard he was a loner, maybe even a bit of a drifter despite his family connections to the area." He shrugged. "But there's something solid about him. Reminds me a bit of myself at that age, rough around the edges but with a clear vision of what he wants to build." Hannah said nothing, processing this unexpected turn in her father's thinking. "Besides," Keller added with a sideways glance at his daughter, I haven't seen you look at Harold Whitcomb the way you looked at Lucas Stone over dinner tonight." Hannah's blush deepened. "Pa," Keller chuckled. "I'm not blind, my girl. And I'm not opposed either if that's where your heart is leading you. Any man who would risk his life to save my daughter deserves consideration, in my book." The simple acceptance in her father's words brought tears to Hannah's eyes. She had been so certain he would disapprove of any attachment between her and Lucas that she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge her own feelings. "It's too soon to talk of such things," she protested weakly. "We barely know each other." "Sometimes you know right away," her father countered, a faraway look coming into his eyes. "It was that way with your mother. Saw her at a church social my first week in Deer Lodge, and I knew before we'd even been properly introduced that she was the one for me." Hannah had heard this story many times, but never had it resonated with her own experience until now. The instant connection she had felt with Lucas, even in the midst of danger and fear, was that what her father had felt all those years ago. "He might not feel the same way," Hannah said softly, giving voice to her deepest fear. Thomas Keller snorted. "That young man didn't ride all the way into town just for a sack of flour and some coffee, Hannah. He could have sent one of his hands for supplies if that's all he wanted." The observation gave Hannah a flutter of hope that carried her through the week that followed. Lucas's order arrived from Helena as promised, and Hannah took special care packaging it herself, including a note thanking him again for joining them for dinner and confirming the invitation for the following Sunday. When Sunday arrived, Lucas appeared promptly at the appointed time, this time bringing a small gift for Hannah, a book of poetry he had ordered from back east. "Mrs. Holden mentioned you enjoy reading," he explained somewhat awkwardly, as Hannah accepted the gift with surprise and pleasure. "I thought you might like this." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Hannah deeply. It revealed an attention to her interests that none of her previous suitors had shown. Harold Whitcomb brought flowers or chocolates, conventional gifts that any young lady might appreciate. Lucas had chosen something specifically for her. That second dinner established a pattern. Lucas began coming to town more frequently, often timing his visits to coincide with the quieter periods at the Mercantile when Hannah might have a few minutes to talk. He joined the Kellers for Sunday dinner without fail, gradually growing more comfortable in their home and revealing more of himself in conversation. As spring gave way to early summer, Hannah found herself falling deeper under Lucas's spell. It wasn't just his physical attractiveness, though she certainly wasn't immune to his rugged good looks. It was the way he listened when she spoke, taking her ideas and opinions seriously. It was his quiet integrity, his dedication to rebuilding something meaningful, his respect for the land and the people who worked it. The townsfolk noticed the developing relationship as well. Eyebrows were raised when Lucas began escorting Hannah to church on Sundays, sitting beside her in the Keller family pew. Whispers followed them when they were seen walking together along Main Street after services, deep in conversation. Harold Whitcomb, after one final attempt to win Hannah's attention, withdrew his suit with quiet dignity, wishing her well but making it clear he would not compete for her affections. By midsummer, it was generally accepted in Deer Lodge that Hannah Keller and Lucas Stone were walking out together, as the local expression went. What was less clear to the curious townsfolk was how serious the attachment might be. Lucas was not a demonstrative man in public, and Hannah maintained a proper distance in her dealings with him when others were present. In private moments, however, their growing closeness was undeniable. A brush of hands when Lucas helped Hannah into his wagon for a Sunday drive. The way their eyes sought each other across a room, the increasingly personal nature of their conversations as they shared hopes, fears, and memories. It was during one such conversation, on a warm evening in late July, that Lucas finally spoke of his feelings directly. They had driven to a scenic overlook after dinner, a spot where the valley stretched out below them, the town of Deer Lodge visible in the distance, and the mountains rising majestically beyond. "I never thanked you," Lucas said as they sat side by side on the wagon seat, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Hannah looked at him in surprise. "For what? I'm the one who owes you thanks." "For making me part of something again," Lucas explained, his voice low and serious. "When I came back to Montana, I was focused on the land, on fulfilling my promise to reclaim what my father had lost. I wasn't looking to connect with people, to be part of a community." He turned to face her, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "You changed that, Hannah. You and your father welcoming me into your home, your lives." Hannah's heart beat faster at the sincerity in his voice. "We're the ones who are fortunate," she said softly, "to have you in our lives." Lucas shook his head slightly. "You don't understand. After my parents died, I closed myself off. It was easier that way, safer. I worked, I saved, I planned for the day I could reclaim the double S, but I didn't let myself get close to anyone. Not really." He took a deep breath. "Then I heard your cries for help that day, and everything changed." Hannah held her breath, hardly daring to hope he was saying what she thought he was saying. "I know it hasn't been long," Lucas continued, reaching for her hand. "Just a few months since the flood. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." His fingers tightened around hers. "I love you, Hannah Keller. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I pulled you from that wagon, and every day since has only confirmed what my heart already knew." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes as the words she had longed to hear finally came. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything now," he assured her quickly. "I know this might seem sudden, and I wouldn't want to rush you into—" Hannah cut him off by placing her free hand gently against his cheek. "I love you too," she said simply. "I think I've known it since that day on the ranch when you didn't laugh at my dreams but took them seriously instead." The joy that transformed Lucas's face at her words was something Hannah knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward until his lips met hers in a first kiss that was both tender and filled with promise. When they finally broke apart, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I want to build a life with you, Hannah. Not just the ranch, but something more. A partnership, a family, a future together." "Nothing would make me happier," Hannah replied truthfully. They returned to town as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, both glowing with the knowledge of their shared feelings. Thomas Keller took one look at their faces as they entered and nodded to himself, as if confirming something he had long suspected. The following Sunday, after church and before dinner, Lucas formally asked Thomas Keller for permission to court his daughter with the intention of marriage. Hannah, listening from the kitchen doorway, held her breath as her father considered the request. "You love her?" Keller asked directly. "With all my heart," Lucas replied without hesitation, "and you'll respect her spirit. Let her be the woman she is, not try to turn her into something else." Lucas smiled at that. "Sir, Hannah's spirit is what I love most about her. I wouldn't change a thing." Keller nodded, satisfied. "Then you have my blessing and my congratulations. You're getting the best of the Kellers, young man." "I know," Lucas agreed, his eyes finding Hannah in the doorway. "Believe me, I know." Their courtship progressed swiftly after that, with a wedding planned for the autumn, after the harvest, and before the harsh Montana winter set in. Hannah divided her time between helping her father at the store and working with Mrs. Holden to prepare the ranch house for her arrival as its new mistress. Lucas, for his part, threw himself into completing renovations on the main house, determined to make it a comfortable home for his bride. The story of their romance, beginning with Hannah trapped in a flooding wagon and Lucas breaking the door to save her, became a favorite in Deer Lodge, retold and embellished with each telling until it had taken on almost mythic proportions. Hannah didn't mind the exaggerations. The truth of what had happened that day and the love that had grown from it was miracle enough for her. On a crisp October day in 1882, with the aspen trees glowing gold on the mountainsides and the first hint of winter in the air, Hannah Keller became Hannah Stone in a ceremony that brought together the entire community of Deer Lodge. The mercantile closed for the day, and even the bank suspended operations so that all could attend the wedding of Thomas Keller's daughter to the man who had saved her life. The ceremony was held in the white clapboard church on Main Street, with Reverend Miller officiating and Mrs. Holden sniffling happily in the front pew. Hannah wore a gown of ivory silk that her father had ordered specially from Helena, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to her mother. Lucas, looking more nervous than Hannah had ever seen him, waited at the altar in a new suit, his eyes never leaving her as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. "You are so beautiful," Lucas whispered as Hannah reached his side, his voice carrying to the first few rows and bringing smiles to the faces of those closest to them. The vows they exchanged were traditional but spoken with such evident sincerity that many in the congregation found themselves blinking back tears. When Reverend Miller pronounced them man and wife, Lucas's kiss was brief, but filled with such tenderness that a spontaneous round of applause broke out among the guests. The celebration that followed at the newly renovated Double S Ranch went well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under a canopy of stars. Thomas Keller, watching his daughter waltz in her new husband's arms, felt a bittersweet happiness. He would miss Hannah's presence in his home and in the store, but he could not have wished for a better man to entrust with her future. As the last of the guests departed, Lucas led Hannah to the porch of what was now their home. In the silvery moonlight, he took both her hands in his. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," he said softly. Hannah smiled up at him, her heart so full she could hardly speak. "I never thought I'd find such happiness," she admitted, "especially not here in Deer Lodge where I once felt so trapped by expectations. And now I feel free," Hannah replied, surprising herself with the realization. "Free to be who I truly am, to build something meaningful with you, to create the life we both want." She reached up to touch his face, still amazed that she could do so whenever she wished. "All because you heard my cries that day." Lucas turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "I'd break down 100 wagon doors to reach you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I'd brave any flood, face any danger." "Let's hope you won't have to," Hannah replied with a small laugh. "One flood in a lifetime is quite enough for me." Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Hannah rested her head on Lucas's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, nothing like the devastating downpour that had brought them together, just a soft, life-giving shower that would nourish the land they both loved. "What are you thinking?" Lucas asked, his fingers combing through her loose hair. "I was thinking about how sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead to the best," Hannah replied thoughtfully. "If that flood hadn't happened, if my wagon hadn't been trapped." She shuddered slightly at the memory. "SHH," Lucas soothed, his arms tightening around her. "It did happen, and I found you, and now we have our whole lives ahead of us." "Our whole lives," Hannah repeated, savoring the words and all they promised. "I can't wait to see what they hold." In the years that followed, Hannah and Lucas built the life they had dreamed of together. The Double S Ranch prospered under their joint care, with Lucas managing the livestock and land, while Hannah applied her business acumen to the financial aspects of the operation. Together, they weathered the challenges that came their way: harsh winters, market fluctuations, the occasional drought, with a resilience born of their deep connection to each other and to the land. Thomas Keller sold the mercantile after 5 years and moved into a comfortable cabin built for him on the ranch property, where he delighted in helping with his grandchildren, first a son, Thomas Lucas, born a year after the wedding, followed 2 years later by twin daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth. Mrs. Holden remained with them until her passing at her ripe old age, as much a part of the family as any blood relative. She taught Hannah all her secret recipes and helped raise the children, who called her Grandmother Holden, and listened wide-eyed to her oft-repeated tale of how their father had rescued their mother from certain death during the Great Flood of 1882. Deer Lodge grew and changed with the coming of the railroad and Montana's transition from territory to state, but the Stone family remained a constant, respected presence in the community. Hannah fulfilled her dream of opening a bookshop in town, a small but thriving business that became a cultural center for the growing settlement. Lucas served on the town council for many years, his practical wisdom and integrity making him a valued voice in local governance. And on each anniversary of the day Lucas had pulled Hannah from the flood-trapped wagon, they would take a private moment together, just the two of them, to remember and to give thanks for the disaster that had brought them together and the love that had transformed both their lives. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if there had been no flood that day? Hannah asked Lucas on their 30th anniversary, as they sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Lucas, his dark hair now streaked with silver but his blue eyes as intense as ever, considered the question seriously. "I'd like to think we would have found each other somehow," he said finally. "That some force in the universe would have drawn us together, flood or no flood." Hannah smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think you're right," she agreed. "Some things are simply meant to be." And as the sun set over the mountains of Montana, painting the sky in colors as brilliant as those on the day Lucas had first professed his love, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that this life, this love, had indeed been meant to be a destiny set in motion the moment she had cried out for help, and Lucas Stone had answered, breaking down the door that had trapped her and opening the way to a love that would endure for all their days.